On a sunny morning in Muan, South Korea, Lee Gunung was going about his usual routine, preparing to open his restaurant that specializes in mud-flet octopus, a beloved local delicacy. It was a peaceful start to the day, with the familiar sights and sounds of the area surrounding Muan International Airport filling the air. His restaurant, located just about 330 yards from the southern end of the airport's runway, offered a clear view of planes as they landed and took off. This proximity to the airport made it a perfect spot to occasionally glimpse the graceful descent of airplanes or watch the flocks of birds gathering near the beach. That morning, however, was anything but ordinary. At around 8:57 a.m., Lee heard a series of loud bangs. At first, he dismissed the sounds as nothing out of the ordinary. They reminded him of the incomplete combustion noises often produced by motorbikes, or the gunshots used to scare birds away from the airport. Yet there was something peculiar about these sounds, something louder, sharper, and altogether different from what he was used to. Intrigued and slightly alarmed, he left the kitchen and stepped out into the parking lot to get a better look at what was happening. The sight that greeted him was startling. Instead of flying along its usual path over the runway, an airplane was positioned directly above his restaurant. It was flying at an unusually low altitude and was tilted slightly to the right. For a moment, Lee froze, trying to process what he was seeing. It was clear to him that something was very wrong. The plane seemed to be heading toward his building rather than the runway, a sight he had never encountered before. The strange angle and proximity of the aircraft filled him with an uneasy sense of dread. As he watched, the plane ascended slightly and began to make a sharp turn to the right. The maneuver was abrupt and unsettling, forming a tight U-turn that looked dangerously unnatural. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that the plane was in serious trouble. Trusting his instincts, he grabbed his phone and climbed to the rooftop of his restaurant, hoping to capture the moment on video. Something told him that this was an event that needed to be recorded. From the rooftop, Lee began filming. The airplane, still struggling in the air, seemed to be moving farther away from the runway and closer to disaster. Within moments, the unthinkable happened. The aircraft crashed and an enormous explosion shook the ground. The force of the blast sent a rush of intense heat toward him, searing his face like the opening of a sauna door. He was momentarily stunned by the sheer power of the impact. Flames and smoke filled the air, and debris was flung in all directions. The initial explosion was so massive that it seemed to envelop everything in its path. Smaller blasts followed, adding to the chaos and destruction. Despite the overwhelming scene, Lee continued to film. He climbed down from the rooftop of his restaurant and moved to the rooftop of a neighboring building, which offered an even closer view of the crash site. From there, he recorded another video, capturing the relentless smoke and flames. The heat was almost unbearable, a stark reminder of how close he was to the unfolding tragedy. He watched as firefighting trucks arrived, but they were unable to approach the crash site directly due to the intensity of the fire. The firefighters had no choice but to spray water from a distance, a futile-looking effort against the roaring inferno. The events of that morning left an indelible mark on Lee. That night, he found himself unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, vivid after-images of the explosion replayed in his mind. The sights and sounds of the crash were etched into his memory, refusing to let him rest. Desperate for some semblance of normalcy, he turned to his phone, scrolling through news updates about the tragedy in hopes of finding some clarity or closure. The relentless images and headlines only deepened his sense of unease. By 6 a.m. the next morning, sleep still eluding him, Lee returned to his restaurant. He tried to immerse himself in his daily routine, but the memories of the crash lingered, casting a shadow over everything. That evening, he resorted to drinking alcohol, hoping it would numb his mind and help him finally get some rest. Yet, the weight of what he had witnessed was not so easily lifted. Lee's wife was away at her parents' home during this time, leaving him to face the emotional aftermath alone. A phone call with her offered some comfort as he recounted the events of that day and the overwhelming emotions that followed. While speaking to her helped ease some of his burden. It was clear that the trauma of the crash would not fade quickly. Each time he went online and saw news articles or videos related to the tragedy, he felt a lump in his throat. The images of the crash, the flames, and the aftermath were inescapable, a constant reminder of the catastrophic event that had unfolded just outside his restaurant. The Jeju Air Flight 7C-2216 crash claimed the lives of 179 people, leaving only 2 survivors. For Lee, the event was not just a tragic news story. It was a deeply personal and harrowing experience. His videos, among the first to be shared with the world, became a critical part of documenting the disaster. Yet, they also served as a source of his anguish, replaying the horror he had witnessed every time he revisited them. The event was a stark reminder of how quickly life can change and how witnessing tragedy can leave an indelible mark on those who experience it. As the days passed, Lee grappled with the emotional weight of that fateful morning, searching for ways to come to terms with the memories that had forever altered his life.